Tonight we have Gary Webb on the show.
Yes, and actually he's waiting in the wings. Are you there, Gary?
Yes, I am.
How are you doing?
I'm okay. How are you two?
Good. Okay, well, it's been great having you here on the program, and there's a lot that you have to tell us, I'm sure. We have an excellent book in front of us, Dark Alliance. Perhaps you could just start by giving us some background about what led up to writing this book.
Well, I was a newspaper reporter for the San Jose Mercury News in San Jose, California, and I was covering actually state government at the time. I worked out of the Capitol Bureau, and I was covering drug issues, and I started doing stories about drug asset forfeitures and how those laws were being abused by the police and prosecutors in the state of California. And as a result of those stories, I got a call from someone who wanted to tell me another story, which typically happens when you write one thing. People will call and say, well, if you think that's bad, listen to this. And so what I ended up doing was writing a series of stories for the Mercury News about a drug ring in California that operated for about 10 years. And during most of that time, they were selling cocaine to the gangs of Los Angeles, the Crips and the Bloods. And some of the money they were making was used to buy weapons for a guerrilla group in Nicaragua called the Contras, which were being run by the Central Intelligence Agency at that time and during most of their existence. And basically the story was about how this drug ring came into South Central LA in the early 1980s to raise money for this guerrilla war and ended up dumping tons of cocaine into South Central Los Angeles because they met this teenage kid named Freeway Ricky Ross, who was one of the biggest crack dealers in South Central. And they set up a sort of a partnership to move this cocaine through black neighborhoods. And what happened was they were delivering all this cocaine into South Central right at the time people in South Central were figuring out how to turn it into crack, how the dealers were figuring out how to turn it into crack. And so the thrust of the story was that this drug pipeline had been instrumental in starting the crack problem in South Central, which eventually spread to the rest of the United States. And that it was sort of the back end of a government covert operation to arm and finance this guerrilla group. So that's what led to the book, which was a greatly expanded version of that newspaper series.
So can you remember your reaction, at how you felt when you first realized that there might be some government complicity in the distribution of cocaine?
Well, I mean, it was suggested to me right off the bat, and I thought it was ridiculous. You know, the woman who called me to give me the initial tip claimed that she had documents that showed that a Nicaraguan drug trafficker had confessed to a federal grand jury that he had been selling cocaine in Los Angeles for the Contras. Now, the thing is, the story about the Contras selling cocaine was not a new one. It had come out in the 1980s here and there and had been widely dismissed by the government and by the national media as, left-wing propaganda. But, I mean, here was hard evidence from one of the people who was involved in it that it had happened. Plus, nobody knew that they were doing it in Los Angeles. And certainly nobody knew that they were selling it to the gangs of Los Angeles. So that was all new stuff. And my reaction on learning that was, maybe now we have an answer for this question of why crack started where it started and why it started in black neighborhoods. I mean, that was a weird thing about it. I mean, drugs are pretty democratic, but crack was a particularly black phenomenon. And the reason I discovered was because that's where it started, in black neighborhoods, and the infrastructures were set up there and they spread to other black neighborhoods. So you had this very ugly picture of this sort of government-protected drug ring selling crack in the inner cities and making money off of it to buy weapons. Pretty ugly picture.
Well, the theme of the CIA selling drugs for war funding or whatever, that's gone back quite a few years to heroin days.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess it's not really something new in that respect, but
it's new to the American public because they never get told that very often.
Right.
Or often enough to remind them that, this isn't just wild fantasy. I mean, it's history, and it's happened repeatedly. And that's one of the things that I ran into when we published the series, was that it was such a fantastic sounding charge to people who had never heard it before that, the idea that the U.S. government agency could be involved in drug trafficking was just preposterous. But that's because they didn't know about, the incidents during the Vietnam War and the incidents during the Afghan conflict and everything else. I mean, it sort of goes hand in hand. And the public isn't told that.
Right. And of course, as you illustrated so finely in your book, there was something else that happened with the crack cocaine explosion, and that there was somebody in a position who just had a real good knack for marketing, and he was well connected. And maybe you could just give us a little bit of detail about the life of Ricky Ross, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't mind at all. The thing to remember about this drug ring is that it wasn't like ones you see in the movies. I mean, for instance, the fellow who was in charge of the L.A. distribution end of it, he had an MBA in marketing. He used to work for the Nicaraguan government. He was a marketing official there. So he had training in this area. They had a fellow who was advising them on weapons and purchasing weapons for them, who was an ex-police officer who'd been in Vietnam. He'd been, he had a very sort of spooky background. They had another advisor to this group that was advising them on whether things they were selling were against national security or not. The money launderer for the organization was a macroeconomist. I mean, he was on the Central Bank of Nicaragua before the Somoza regime collapsed. So these were very well-educated people. I mean, this isn't like a couple of bums who get together and decide to sell cocaine. And the man they were buying it from, this fellow Norwin Meneses, was one of the top drug traffickers in the world in Central America, and had been for years. I mean, he had started cocaine pipelines with the Peruvians and the Bolivians. I mean, he predated the Colombian cartels being formed. So these were veteran smugglers, they were veteran drug traffickers, and it was a very well-organized group, which, in real life, that doesn't happen that way. This was an organization that was set up for a purpose, and their purpose was to raise money through drug trafficking and money laundering and whatever else they were doing. I mean, I only know a portion of what this drug ring did.
Now, Ricky Ross, though, he was a bit of an anomaly, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was the odd man in this group because he had no political connections. He had no idea that there was a war in Nicaragua or that there was such a thing as the Contras or the Sandinistas. He was just a really good cocaine trafficker. And he met up with his MBA, and the MBA decided to supply him with just as much cocaine as he wanted, and Ricky went out and marketed it and sold it, and was the biggest supplier to the L.A. crack market during the years it was being formed. So, I don't think picking Ricky Ross was an accident. I think they figured out he was a guy that knew his stuff, and they were just looking to sell cocaine. I mean, you got to put yourself in the Contra's position for a minute. Their assignment was to go raise money. They need to sell cocaine. They need to find somebody they can trust to sell it. And Rick apparently fit all those qualifications, and they were pretty much untouched by law enforcement for many years.
Well, it's funny reading your description in your book, and it's a wonderful book, by the way, days to read it, and a lot of reading material. But Ricky Ross wasn't the gangsta guy that you see on TVs. You know what I mean? What you see?
No.
Not at all did he fit that description. And as you mentioned, he was well appreciated in his neighborhood for putting back into it. Not what you'd expect from what you think of as being a kingpin with no moral conscience. Maybe I don't know. Do you think he really realized what he unleashed on his own people?
I don't think he realized it at the time, but of course he realized it later on. I think initially he saw a good opportunity, and he was a smart enough businessman to spot a trend and decide to supply that trend. And he did a very, sort of professional job about setting up this marketing operation. Of course he knew what was going on because he could see it in his own neighborhoods, and he started having friends that were getting strung out on crack. And that's part of why he decided to quit once. The biggest part was because he was close to being arrested, but he said he also didn't care about getting out of it because he finally saw what it was doing. I think he probably knew it was doing a lot longer than that and just didn't want to look at it. Here was a kid that didn't have much money, and suddenly he's making millions, and I don't really think he did a lot of moral examination about how he was getting this money. It was just coming in. You could buy it very cheaply, because before, when you think about cocaine, before crack, it was a very expensive habit to have, and not a lot of people used it because it was extremely expensive. It was hard to get. And what crack did was sort of democratize it. It allowed people who wanted to use cocaine to do it at a much cheaper unit cost than they could before, and it gave them a lot bigger kick than powder cocaine did. So it was sort of the, a new twist to an old drug, but a very dangerous one because it affected the body a lot differently than other forms of using cocaine did. So it was bad, and it made it extremely popular as well.
Now, speaking along those lines, there was actually some forewarning that there was going to be a problem. Well, it wasn't there, but it wasn't until the mainstream media, and really there was a serious problem already in place before the mainstream media really picked up on it. But from what you've written, I understand that Dr. Bick, if that's how I pronounce his name,
right,
he was trying to raise alarms in the late 70s.
Yeah, that was a fascinating part of the research that I found, was that, like a lot of people, I thought crack had just sort of come out of nowhere and surprised everybody. And then when I was researching it, I found this congressional testimony from this Dr. Robert Bick from Yale, who just went up before Congress and said, look, I really don't like talking about this in public, but we've got to do something about it. We've got a huge problem coming, and it's going to be worse than any of the epidemics you've ever seen unless we do something about it now. And that's pretty much word for word what he told his congressional committee. And nobody paid any attention to him because everybody believed that, cocaine was fairly harmless. You couldn't get addicted to it. It wasn't a huge problem. And what Bick was saying was that, well, the way people are using it now, that's right. But if they start smoking it, like they're going to start doing, it becomes a very different drug. It becomes a very dangerous drug. And he was ignored. And I think the worst part about it is that, when I interviewed him many, many years later, he said that the government wouldn't even provide money for research. They didn't even want to know about it. He said we couldn't get any research grants funded to test on the effects of smoking cocaine. He said the only data we had were from South American psychiatrists. So he said we couldn't even get started with a plan to warn people, to stay away from it because we didn't really know what it did to you. And they stayed in that state until like 1986, when the crack problem suddenly was everywhere. And Bick went back before Congress and said, look, I told you it was going to happen. It happened. Now are you going to believe me? Now we got to do something about it. And what they did was increase prison sentences, and they didn't do anything else. So, it's been a problem the federal government, was aware of, and the White House was aware of it, the DEA was aware of it, and nobody did anything about it.
Well, actually, it does make a person wonder just maybe even how soon they were aware of it. With aside from Dr. Bick's concerns, the CIA was well known to be around a lot of nations checking things out. And from what you wrote about the problems that were arising in Peru from people smoking the paste and stuff, one would think that it would have come to the notice of a group like something, like the CIA. Well,
it certainly came to the notice of the DEA bureau in Lima because Bick asked them to send back a quantity of it so he could study it. And he said he gave it to the DEA agent in Lima, Peru, and he never saw it again. So, somebody had it, but he never got it. He was never allowed to legally import it into the country, which he thought was crazy. He said, since I could go down any street corner and buy it, but they wouldn't let me bring it in legally for study purposes.
Right. So he actually went down to Peru to do his studies, right?
One of his medical students did.
Oh, a student, right.
And that's when, see, Bick and this fellow, I'm trying to think of his name, he's an anesthesiologist, were like the two first American scientists to figure out what was going on down in Central America regarding cocaine smoking, because it was a very new phenomenon in 1977, 78. So he sent this medical student down there to do a study on the Indians and cocaine. And when he got down there, he realized that people everywhere were smoking crack. And friends of his in Peru were taking him around to these neighborhoods where everybody was out in the streets just zombied out on it. And he said he got to the phone, he called up Dr. Beck in Yale and said, if this shit ever hits the United States, we got a really serious problem. And that's when he was allowed to do some studies on it, but that's as far as the research went. I mean, they found out about it, and they presented papers, and they tried to go to Congress and tell them that this stuff was happening, and nobody did anything.
And far be it from the regular, normally ingested way of cocaine. I mean, we're talking about hallucinations, and I'm sure there are probably a few people listening who've known somebody who's been addicted to that stuff. It's I recognize what I read in your book, and I'm just going, gee, I mean, it's just terrible. A real psychosis. This is not. I never saw that kind of reaction.
No, you didn't have that kind of reaction when you took it through the nose. And that was what was so different about crack. And that's really what I thought was a key element in this book, was that, number one, crack was on its way up here. Number two, the U.S. government knew about it. And number three, at the same time it's getting here, the Contras are running around Los Angeles selling cocaine, which had not been sold in the ghettos much before, because of the price. But they were selling cocaine, and soon enough, crack was resulting in South Central. So, I mean, I think what I laid out is this sort of chain reaction that happened, basically because the Contras needed money to fund their operations and decided to do it by selling drugs.
So all the cards were in place, and things just had a domino effect, and it was a natural evolution of something this potentially disastrous.
Yeah, it was. I mean, one of the criticisms of my series afterwards was that it's not fair to pin the crack epidemic on this drug ring. It happened in a lot of places, which is true. It did happen in a lot of places, but it happened in a lot of places over a long period of time. It started in South Central, and it stayed in South Central for a couple of years before it started breaking out in Miami. And again, and I get into the book, in the Miami crack market was also being fueled by political money, because there was a battle for Haiti going on, and it's just it's unbelievable the way things work in this world. But there were political overtones to the Miami crack market as well. But it was the fact that it took hold in South Central first, which also was the home of these street gangs, which were already selling drugs. I mean, the Crips and the Bloods were already selling grass. They were already selling PCP. So this was just another thing for them to sell. But it was so profitable that it allowed the Crips and the Bloods to go from L.A. to other cities and start their own crack markets in other black neighborhoods. And so you really did have a domino effect that I don't think anybody at the beginning of the line anticipated at the end of the line, but it doesn't relieve the people at the beginning of the line from sort of starting the dominoes in motion.
Well, you can have a lot of dangerous drugs out there. Heroin didn't affect one area of the market the way it did, perhaps just because it wasn't introduced, though that could be chance as much as anything else. I know there's a lot of concern about the CIA targeting black neighborhoods, and I wouldn't necessarily dispute that, in that it would have been thought, okay, we're not as likely to get a lot of groundswell complaints about what's happening here. But at the same time, they didn't really discriminate that much when it came to importing heroin, for example. Whoever would buy it, and this was just a fast-growing market.
Well, I think the thing that happened here was that you had people that were looking to sell drugs that didn't really know where to sell them, and bumped into somebody who was very good at what he did, and they sort of had this union. I don't think there was any more plan than that. I think the Nicaraguans were looking to sell to whoever could buy it, and were delighted when they found this black kid who could move as much stuff as they could sell him. So it was really a marriage convenience. And I mean, you can speculate as to why they didn't go into Hispanic neighborhoods or why they didn't go into white neighborhoods. But I think the fact that you had a South Central market there, which historically had a drug problem, historically had poor police protection, you had flourishing drug markets down there already. It was sort of a good place if you're the Nicaraguan drug dealer to say, okay, let me look down there. This is where I could probably safely sell it. And they happened to run into Rick Ross, who was sort of an up-and-coming drug czar at that time.
Now, I have one question, Gary, about this Rick Ross thing. Can you shed any light to his first arrest when he was sentenced to serve time in Texas? in which he had a very short stint, 10 months, I believe.
Right.
And then and it was kind of like they said, okay, keep quiet and you'll just do some time. When he came out, he went to the press. The second time they set him up, and now he's in there for life without parole. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, what happened was he testified against. One of the delicious ironies of this book is that these people come back around and bite each other several times. When Rick Ross was at his peak in L.A., the L.A. County Sheriff's Office and the L.A. County PD decided, we need to do something about this guy, and they set up a task force solely concentrated to run Rick Ross out of town. And they did that by, beating people up and planting drugs and falsifying arrest search warrants and that sort of thing. But he got the message and he left town. As part of this investigation into Rick Ross, a number of these cops also found out about the Nicaraguans who were dealing dope with him. And they pursued an investigation against the Nicaraguans, the Contras. And they never got anywhere with it. They arrested one of them with cocaine, and nobody ever prosecuted him, and he was let out. And eventually they all became targets of federal grand jury investigations about corruption in the local police department.
Those officers.
The same officers that were involved in investigating the CIA-linked drug dealers came under investigation themselves. And ironically, one of the people that the government used to testify against them was Rick Ross, because they had been chasing him for many years and committing all sorts of civil rights violations, which they were allowed and encouraged to do. So then the government turned around and prosecuted them and ran most of them either out of the police force. They put some of them in jail. So when this information surfaced about what they found, and they did a raid on this drug ring's leaders, and they found a lot of very interesting stuff. They found Contra documents, they found weapons manuals, they found Contra war bonds, correspondence from the Contras, the Contra bank records. Clearly, these guys were intimately involved with the Contra operation in Los Angeles. And all that stuff disappeared from the evidence room shortly after they brought it in. And no charges could be filed. And they began to get very suspicious about the CIA involvement and started complaining about it. And then, bingo, they all get indicted. So when Rick testified against them, part of his deal was that he got to walk on these other charges that he'd been arrested for, which is why he did, 10 months in jail in Texas. But, the irony is that as soon as he got out of jail, the federal government wanted him back in jail, and they sent his old Nicaraguan cocaine trafficker buddy after him, who was now working, he'd gone from the Contras to sort of running an independent drug ring, and then now he was working for the DEA as a full-time informant. That's how blurry the lines are in this drug war.
I found it absolutely amazing that the main kingpin could be used by the DEA to round up all these people, and I don't know how many people were actually rounded up, or if it was just an excuse to give him cover to continue to do his business. It gets pretty confusing after a while. Speaking of Norwin Meneses.
Oh yeah, and he was the guy that had the real CIA connections. The fellow in Los Angeles wasn't as plugged in as Meneses was, and Meneses had been in the United States and operated fairly openly for many years. The files that the government had on him and his drug trafficking activities were pretty voluminous, and nobody ever arrested him. Nobody ever bothered him. I think one of the reasons was because his family had been close to the Central Intelligence Agency in Nicaragua. His brother was the chief of the police of Managua, a general who was assassinated by leftist guerrillas in Central America. Another brother was a general in the National Guard. He came from a very well-connected family politically. And he lived in San Francisco for a long time, unmolested. And then he went down to Central America at the height of the Contra War and volunteered to work for the DEA because he was such a believer in the Reagan administration's ideals that this drug trafficker just walks in off the street and volunteers to work for them. So what happened when this occurred was that the FBI, which I think was diligently trying to arrest him, there was a couple of agents in the San Francisco FBI office that had been investigating Meneses for years and years and years and pulled off repeatedly. And I think they finally had him on something. Well, they definitely had him on something, so he runs to the DEA and says, I want to work for you, so nobody ever prosecuted him for that. And then he gets out of jail, and he got caught in Managua with 750 kilos of cocaine, but this was like in 1996, so nothing happened to him until then.
Yeah, I found that very fascinating, how he operated in the United States for so many years, and it wasn't until he was in Nicaragua that he actually got busted, which just goes to say a few things about...
Well, especially when you consider the capabilities of the Nicaraguan drug police, which was basically this one guy, and the capabilities of the U.S. government, which is spy satellites and listening devices and armies of drug agents. And Meneses was here in the United States, and they couldn't seem to figure out enough to prosecute him on. But one guy in the Nicaraguan police finds him with 750 kilos of cocaine. So, it wasn't hard. It wasn't hard work if you wanted to do it. It was just that nobody wanted to do it for reasons that I think became obvious as I got further into this, is that he was being protected because he was working at various times for the U.S. government. He was one of our friends.
Well, there's something that you brought up that I found very fascinating and relevant to a lot of this perhaps type of case, and that is the way that officers almost become proprietors of individuals if they are first to enter them into a computer.
Yeah.
That puts somebody in a serious advantage if they intend to conspire with somebody. If they end up being the so-called agent who is responsible for investigating them, well, all of a sudden you've created catch-22 where nothing's going to happen.
Well, yeah, and that was another thing that I didn't realize until I got into the book, was that he had basically control agents when he was working for the DEA. And the teletypes that I got from the FBI were just like screaming, we want this guy up here. They indicted him in San Francisco for conspiracy to traffic cocaine, and this was during a time where he was like running Contra meetings and meeting with Contra leaders, and we had pictures of him standing next to Adolfo Colero, who was the head CIA agent running the Contras, and yet he's under indictment for drug trafficking during this entire time. And that's when he skips out of the country and goes to work for the DEA in Costa Rica, allegedly working on Contra projects down there, doing money laundering for them. So, it was really frustrating for these FBI agents who were trying to get him, and it was very frustrating for the U.S. Attorney's Office, which was trying to get him back to prosecute him, because another arm of the U.S. government was protecting him. And this was, and again, this was while he was trafficking in cocaine all over the world.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to fathom that he could be so blatant about it without somebody.
Well, he can be blatant about it because he was useful.
Right.
He was a useful guy, and money needed laundered. He knew how to do it. The fact that he was a murderer and a major international drug trafficker, it doesn't matter as long as he's useful, I guess.
Now, there were some horrible, horrible things going on in Nicaragua before the Sandinistas took over. Could you give us a little bit of background on the Contras? I found this quite interesting because I had never really heard that much about them when I was younger. To me, they were just, they were a bunch of good guys who got ousted from their country and wanted to take it back from the commies. But then when you get into it and you realize, well, the Sandinistas were voted out, the people wanted them there, and there was some terrible things happening, before they actually took power. What kind of background can you give us on the Contras and perhaps what the political environment of Nicaragua when they started their wars here?
Well, before the Sandinista Revolution, and that was, I believe, in July of '79, it was a typical Central American dictatorship. It was run by a family, the Somoza family, who were allies of the United States. Like I said earlier, we trained their army. We gave them millions of dollars worth of arms every year. We showed them how to do intelligence work. We used Nicaragua a couple of times for CIA covert operations. The Bay of Pigs was one of them. The overthrow of the Arbenz government in Guatemala was also staged from Nicaragua. So, they were friends. And the Sandinistas came in and threw them out and said, well, we're not your friends anymore, basically. We're going to run the country the way we want to run it, and screw you. And the United States didn't like that, and they said, okay, well, CIA, go see what you can do. And what they did was they went out and rounded up all the old soldiers and old generals and officers from the National Guard, which was Somoza's army, and brought them back together and said, okay, we'll finance you if you go in there and blow stuff up and shoot people and do this paramilitary operation. And that's what they decided to do. And Reagan authorized $20 million the first year. And then they set out with this big PR campaign to convince the American public that these were like heroic freedom fighters, that, like you said, there were some State Department memos that came out right around that time in which they talked about having to glue black hats on the Sandinistas and glue white hats on the Contras because that would sell the program to the American public. And so the administration started a very effective propaganda campaign to convince the Americans that, these guys were okay, and Reagan called them the moral equivalent of our founding fathers, and, they had a very, very sort of shiny image, at least as far as the administration went. But the problem was that the CIA knew they were trafficking in drugs from very, very early on. I mean, like 1981, before this thing even officially started. The CIA was aware that the Contra leaders were drug traffickers because they watched, they like literally watched them do it. And that was sort of okay because they were going to run this war for us, and nobody was going to ask too many questions because it was, all being done covertly.
So in the end, the agendas about controlling which governments are in and which are out, that supersedes, I guess, in the minds of people, for example, working with the CIA, in a lot of cases, that supersedes the right of the American public to be protected from whatever they might decide to do to overthrow those. I mean, when you're talking about overthrowing a nation or trying to secure a nation's government or whatever, if they're supposed to be doing whatever's in the interests of the American public, it gets to be pretty clear that really what's going on here is there's financial interests. I mean, from what you described, most of the people who really were the founding members of the Contras were people who had somewhat powerful positions in the regime before, and
right, there were some Somocistas, just virtually, and that was something they kept denying, even though it was painfully obvious to anybody that looked that it was just Somoza's old army and then they had some Sandinistas that had fallen from grace and they joined the Contras, and they had Aiden Pastora, who was a former Sandinista war hero, leading them, and they had all these ragtag bands of mercenaries, and the Costa Rican Contras were mostly Cuban exiles, right-wing Cubans, and they were all drug dealers and arms traffickers as well. So, I mean, you really had a bunch of, mercenaries and cutthroats and Somocistas that really didn't have any plan for doing anything other than harassing the Sandinistas. I don't think anybody ever seriously considered that they were going to win. They were there to destabilize the government. And my point was, okay, whether or not you think that was a worthy cause, the effect was that we started getting crack in the streets of Los Angeles, and I don't know if that was a fair trade,
I found rather interesting the role that Costa Rica ended up playing as sort of an intermediary landing area and whatnot, and a lot of this pretty much started to unravel in that small, fair country, let's say, with, in particular, a DEA agent. And it just goes to show that no matter how well-sealed an organization like this is, there's still individuals that are wild cards and can check into things for themselves. And I wonder, would you mind just going into that a little bit?
That was the DEA agent, Celly Castillo?
Yes.
Yeah, that was sort of a tragic story. He was this former cop from, I think, McAllen, Texas, or MacArthur, Texas, or something, and joined the DEA and became a very successful DEA agent and was sent down to, I think he was sent initially to Guatemala City, but he had responsibility for Guatemala and El Salvador. And on his infrequent trips to El Salvador, he would pick up rumors from informants over there that the Contras were flying drugs and money in and out of this military air base called Ilopango, which the CIA had been using for several years. And then after they were told to get out of the war by Congress, Oliver North and his group used Ilopango for resupply flights as well. And Castillo started investigating these allegations that cocaine was coming in and out, and he believed that he had confirmed them. And, he had eyewitnesses who were telling him that, yes, they'd seen boxes of money he'd run tail checks on the planes, and they were all being run by people who were on DEA watch lists as drug traffickers, and they were also showing up as the CIA was calling up and asking for diplomatic credentials for these guys. So Castillo, I think, figured out what was going on and started recommending that they launch an investigation. And shortly afterwards, he himself came under investigation by the DEA, and nobody ever really bothered to look at what was going on at Ilopango. They never let him on. But years later, the evidence came out that that had been happening, that Castillo's suspicions were correct. But he was eventually run out of the DEA, and he believes, and I think he's probably right, that he had been told to back off this investigation and wouldn't, so they got rid of him. Now, subsequent to that, I spoke to an agent who was in the Mexico City Bureau. He was the head of his name was Hector Barelas, and he was the head of the entire informant squad in Mexico City for the DEA. And he started doing an investigation. Remember that DEA agent, Kiki Camarena, who was killed in, I think, Guadalajara or something, by Mexican drug lords? And they launched a big, huge manhunt for him. And Hector was on this case, and he kept picking up word that there had been airfields that had been protected by the CIA out in the hinterlands where marijuana and military aircraft were frequently seen in combination. And he recommended that the DEA launch an investigation of the CIA. And he was quickly taken off the case and given a desk job in Washington and told that his career at the DEA was basically over with. So, I mean, it happens. That's why it's hard to do anything about these things when they get rooted in systems, They're protected, and I know people don't like to hear that, but that's pretty much the case in this one.
And with your research in this book, that you have the facts here that anyone who has made any kind of effort to follow up, if they suggest any investigation, they're taken off the case.
Yeah, that was pretty true up and down the line. I mean, I also interviewed another DEA agent in the San Francisco office who had been investigating Vanessa's drug ring, and she put two and two together, and this was very, very early on. I mean, her name was Sandra Smith, and she was like one of the first female DEA agents in San Francisco. And she got onto Meneses and his operations and put together a memo which basically said that these people are dealing in arms and drugs, and we really ought to launch an investigation because the guns were supposedly going down to Nicaragua. And it was funny because she was on a stakeout, and I ended up interviewing her, and I also ended up interviewing the guy she was staking out because he was working for the Contras, and he was one of the delivery men for this Contra drug ring. He actually flew the money down to Costa Rica and gave it to CIA agents. But her investigation was shut down, too. She said she got no encouragement. Nobody told her to do it. Nobody told her not to do it. Nobody just said anything, and they assigned her to investigate the Hells Angels. So, that was another DEA investigation I found that went nowhere.
I found it rather amazing how much of what you dug up was a matter of public record, albeit somewhat concealed in many cases. You have to struggle to get it out there, but it does make a person wonder at some point, many of these concealed court records and testimonies, these things are going to come out at some point, be it 100 years from now. People are going to know what the American history's been about.
Well, I think you would hope that, but I don't think you can have faith in that. I mean, and this story was a prime example. I mean, if I hadn't come along 10 years later and been investigating, frankly, something else entirely, I'm sure this story would have never come out. I mean, for all intents and purposes, the Contra drug story was dead. It was dead in the 80s, and nobody was doing any more investigation of it. Not the U.S. government, not the press, not anybody. So I happened to come along 10 years later, not even looking for Contra drug trafficking, and find it, and reignite this issue again, mainly because of the Internet, frankly. But you couldn't count on that happening,
Right. Well, I myself love to sing praises for the Internet, and I think it's done a lot for moving things along, and perhaps a very good timing considering the crises we're all going through. But I have to think that what happened with you, seems to be creating a bit of a snowball effect. And even if things don't change overnight, at some point, policymakers, whether it's people in Congress or whatever, they start to wake up, change a little law here and there, Do you get the sense that this is all part of evolution, or do you think it's a battle to the finish? Or what is your general thought on this whole thing and your view of the American status in the world as opposed to what you might have thought before you got involved in all this?
Well, that's a lot of questions.
Yeah, sorry about that, but a mouthful.
Well, I guess were you asking, do I think it made any difference?
Yeah, sum it up really nicely.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think it made a difference. This is, as much as people will want to ignore it, I mean, this stuff is all out on the public record now. It's there. There have been 2 internal investigations done by the CIA, 1 done by the Department of Justice. Those records are now available, and, anybody that wants to go look at them can. The other thing is, I think while this whole issue may have gone away in white society, in the African-American society, it's very much an issue still. And I think it just serves as another example of how the government really isn't interested in the problems of Black America, because it takes riots, essentially, before anybody pays attention to the problems of urban America. So I think this is just another example of that, but it doesn't mean that people don't know about it, and it doesn't mean that people won't remember it. And the other thing that's sort of encouraging is, I mean, the book was sold, the movie rights to the book were sold, and people are in the process of making a film about it. So
great.
It's sad to have to rely on Hollywood sometimes to popularize unpopular ideas, but sometimes that's all you got.
Right. So when can we expect the movie to be out? Do you know?
Well, it's supposed to, if everything goes according to plan, and nothing ever does. They're supposed to start production in January. I don't know how long it takes to make one of these things, so I don't know. But, within the next year, I would think.
You're listening to Black Op Radio.
Your mentioning of the Internet, that's particularly important to this story, as you outlined in the later part of the book. The way that the San Jose Mercury actually presented evidence when you first broke the stories on the Internet, that pretty much created a phenomenon, actually, even in the Black community, with people signing on and getting online and realizing, I mean, that's true democracy at its finest, really.
Well, yeah, that was the most encouraging part of it, because what happened was, after the stories came out, there was no response from the government, there was no response from the national media, and I think everybody would have been happy if that had stayed that way. But the fact was that people were reading about it through a very unconventional means, which was the Internet, which didn't exist in any decent form until right about then. That was 96. I mean, the World Wide Web was just getting cranked up, and the Mercury News had a very, very advanced web operation because, they're located in Silicon Valley, and they sort of take that thing kind of seriously. And so we had a fantastic web page, and what we did was we not only put up the story that appeared in the newspaper, but we also linked parts of the story to the actual source documents. For example, if we quoted from a grand jury transcript, which we did, you could click on the word transcript, and it'll take you to the transcript, and you could read the transcript for yourself. So you could get all the context you want. You could see exactly what he said in response to what. So you could judge whether or not we were using the quote fairly. And we also had a lot of links to other documents that had been, stuff we got out of the National Archives. A lot of the stuff we got for the series was declassified, especially for us. Not because we're special, but because we'd asked for it. So the stuff, a lot of the files from the Iran-Contra investigation that the prosecutor Lawrence Walsh had done were finally coming up for declassification right at the time I started working on this, and we found a lot of documents in the Walsh files that substantiated a great deal of what we wrote. So we put those up on the Internet. And then we had undercover tapes where these drug traffickers are talking about selling, crack to the gangs. We digitized those and put them on the web as sound samples, so you could actually listen to the tapes yourself. I mean, it was a very cool, sort of really very interactive for newspapers kind of web approach to a story. And we got a lot of very good comments about that web page. It really kept the story alive for a long, long time.
Now, with that kind of effort, did you have any? Tell us about a backlash.
Oh well, the backlash was enormous, and I think for a lot of reasons. But initially, the backlash was that Washington Post did a story that said basically, well, there's all this fuss in the San Jose Mercury News about this crack ring, and, we spent a couple of weeks looking into it, and we don't think there's any reason for anybody to get excited. This was not a very big drug ring. It only sold 5 tons of cocaine, which was false, by the way, but, that was their attitude, only 5 tons. And there's no real hard evidence that the CIA knew about it, so let's just all quit worrying about this thing once and for all. And their sources were unnamed, for the most part, and it was just it was a very funny story, I thought. But people started taking it seriously, and the issue was complicated, so all you really needed to do was throw a couple of stink bombs into the arena, and everybody said, oh, we can't figure this out. So it basically became the Mercury News is wrong, and all these other national newspapers are right, that there really isn't anything here. And nobody ever said it wasn't true. They just said it's not very important.
Right. Well, it's interesting how a paper can claim to investigate something for basically a few days. And how long were you on the story?
Many months. For a year.
Right.
And we did a lot of overseas reporting. We did a lot of running through courthouses and archives and stuff. And, to this day, we've never corrected a word of it. The editor wrote this column and said, well, we'd probably written it differently if we'd had to do it again, but, we stand by the core findings of the series, which everybody immediately said, oh, it's a retraction. Mercury News is backing away from the story. And I think that was a correct perception. I mean, that's what they wanted to do, because the thing had just it turned into such a controversy, and they were getting so much crap from the national press that there really wasn't any benefit, I don't think, to pursuing this story,
Yeah, I mean, you can only expect one outlet to be able to push the thing so far if they end up being ridiculed into a corner and damaging their...
Well, right, and really all a newspaper has is its reputation, so I think they became worried that they were going to be seen as some conspiracy theory rag, and decided not to pursue it anymore. Frankly, I'm always amazed that it even got in the paper in the first place,
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
So I think a lot of people, when they criticize the Mercury, forget that they actually printed it and let the cat out of the bag. I think they later regretted it, but, you can't fault them initially, at least.
No, and I think it's unfortunate that any official agency that is put in charge of just this kind of investigation, they all circle the wagons and deny that anything's out there at all.
Well, the amazing thing was that the whole issue boiled down to whether the CIA would admit that it was dealing with drug traffickers or not, because nobody outside of the CIA was investigating it. The CIA was allowed to investigate itself, and they issued these reports, which were very lengthy, but were about half the size that they were before they were classified, or declassified, I should say. So who knows what else is in these things? I mean, we still haven't seen the unclassified versions of these reports. So the thing that surprised me was that when the CIA came out and said, well, yeah, we were dealing with drug traffickers, but it wasn't, any big deal, and we did give back money to drug traffickers in a couple of cases, but, it was overzealousness on our part, and it wasn't any criminal conspiracy. And that report comes out, and the press doesn't blast it all over the front page. The CIA was involved with drug traffickers. I mean, this is something they've been denying for years, and now they admit it, and it's not a story.
Well, the funny thing is, the way that sounds, it's almost like, well, somebody might have had a gram here and there, but we're talking actually plane loads being run in and with protection. This isn't exactly...
Yeah, that's the thing, that's the issue that people tended to forget in this debate, was that this was not a small-time drug ring. I mean, this was a drug ring that brought cocaine into the United States on freighters. They brought it in on air transport planes. They were the major cocaine suppliers to South Central Los Angeles. They were supplying markets in San Francisco and in Oakland. They were selling it in Kansas City. They were all, pretty much coast to coast. So, yes, a drug ring this size can have a huge impact on an area. And the other thing was, when we were talking about a drug ring that dealt in tons of pure cocaine, by the time you get it down to street level, you got a ton of cocaine, it turns into like 15 tons of crack, which people also seem to forget when they were arguing that, well, one drug ring couldn't have done all this damage.
Yeah, well, that's a lot of people getting high.
Well, that's an enormous amount. I mean, Ross was doing about $3 million a day in crack sales. So you can't say that this drug ring didn't have an effect on that area. It had an enormous effect on it. But that was one of the issues that the critics of the story said were that. And the other amazing thing is most of the information about how big Rick Ross was and how he got to be such a huge drug trafficker had been printed in the LA Times in 1994. But after my story came out saying, yes, Rick Ross was indeed a huge drug trafficker, and he was a huge drug trafficker because he was getting cocaine from the Contras, the LA Times came out and said Rick Ross wasn't a huge drug trafficker after all. It was like Pravda, it was amazing.
We can just rewrite history as we go here to make it convenient.
And nobody seemed to notice.
Well, one of the things that
my editors.
Yeah. One of the things I found extra disturbing, actually, was it's not just we're talking about drugs, but some of the extra crimes that go along with it. And we're talking about people who knew how to really seriously commit murder, torture. And there was one particular case which you outlined. It was in Costa Rica, was it not, where a doctor was abducted and basically
Hugo Spadafora. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I just felt horrible just reading about that. I mean, it hits you home really hard when you realize this is not just a little band of your backdoor terrorists. I mean, this guy was silenced to protect Oliver North when it boils down to, is it not?
Yeah, that was a pretty amazing story. That was another case in history. We were talking earlier about the CIA aligning themselves with drug traffickers. The CIA aligned itself with Manuel Noriega for many years. And I always like to point that out when they say there's no evidence of the CIA being involved with drug traffickers. Manuel Noriega is in jail now for drug trafficking, and he was on the CIA payroll for a long, long time. But that was one of Noriega's stunts, was to have this Dr. Spadafora killed. Spadafora was a Contra. He was working with Aiden Pastor and the Contra army called Arde down in Costa Rica. And he got to know a pilot who flew for Noriega. And this pilot was part of Noriega's drug trafficking operation, or arms trafficking operation, and told him all about Noriega's involvement with drugs. And when Spadafora learned this, he went back to Costa Rica, went to the DEA and told them what he discovered, went to the Costa Rican DOEJOTA, which is their FBI, told them what he discovered, and then he gets kidnapped off a bus and tortured to death and decapitated right afterwards. So, I mean, this was a pretty graphic example of how much, how feared this information was, that Noriega and the Contras were dealing in drugs, because at that time it would have ruined the Contra program in the United States. They would never have gotten another dollar from Congress if it had come out that they were involved in drug trafficking. So a great effort was made to keep this stuff quiet. And Spadafora was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And Oliver North and the U.S. government and were giving Noriega advice on how to weather this bad publicity that he was getting from killing Hugo Spadafora, which is kind of a weird position for the U.S. government to be in, or maybe not.
Yeah, maybe.
What's your opinion of Oliver North?
As what?
Well, do you think he was actually trying in some twisted way to act on behalf of his nation, or was it greed, or was it just twisted James Bond?
No, I think he was genuinely one of these gung-ho guys that victory at any cost, and he was willing to overlook a lot of the drug trafficking that was going on, even though he was getting reports from it. I mean, very clearly. I mean, and we've got copies of these memos. He had somebody in Central America named Rob Owen, who was a CIA informant. He was working for North as a courier. And Owen was sending back memo after memo saying, these guys are corrupt, they're dealing in drugs, they're flying drugs out of here, they're dealing on the black market. Most of these people are just in this war to make money, they don't care about winning. And North was getting these reports and doing nothing about it. And there's a lot of very, very shady stuff that still hasn't come out yet about North and this operation they were running off the coast of Nicaragua with fishing boats. And it was supposed to be electronic surveillance or commando insertion or something like that, but they had drug traffickers running it. They had a boat that they'd gotten from the DEA that had drug traffickers on board. A very weird operation, and only a very little bit of it has ever become public. But one of the things that came out was in the investigations the CIA did later was an interview with one of the Costa Rican drug traffickers who was working on this operation. And they asked him if he was involved in narcotics trafficking, point blank. And he said, well, I'm involved in a lot of work for the National Security Council, so I don't really know how to answer that question. And this was on the record to investigators from the CIA. And the CIA's response was, tell him to go down and change his story. They didn't want to investigate North and these allegations of drug trafficking either.
You're listening to Black Op Radio.
I often wondered how just a colonel could afford to run for, put his campaign up that he ran for a few years ago.
Well, he was, he's very popular among certain circles, and those circles have money.
Well, it's interesting what you mentioned about many of the people fighting not really for the war but for the drugs, because the impression I get here is that not a whole lot was done to discomfort the Sandinistas, aside from a couple attempts to frame them for drug trafficking, which seems totally idiotic in light of what was really going on. Was there, to your knowledge, any serious evidence that the Sandinistas were involved in trafficking, or was this a case of... There
was, the evidence that I have, and I think it's true, came from a man who was working with the Sandinistas and would have been involved in those operations if they'd been going on. And I interviewed him several times. He also worked for the CIA for a while. He also worked for Norland Meneses for a while. So he was fairly well-traveled. And he said the Sandinistas started doing drug trafficking through Cuba to an import-export place in New Orleans, but that it wasn't very successful, and they eventually decided that there were so many U.S. planes and U.S. satellites going overhead that the risk was enormous that they would get caught, and it wasn't worth it politically. But, the thing is, and this is what this fellow told me, was that cocaine trafficking wasn't limited to just the Contras. He said it was sort of the coin of the realm in Central America among all the guerrilla armies that needed money. They would sell cocaine. It's just that the Contras were doing it with the knowledge of the U.S. government and with the inaction of the U.S. government while we were in the midst of this anti-drug campaign.
So, in other words, with the blessing?
Well, I thought it was curious that at the same time the CIA is involved with drug traffickers, the federal administration whips up this huge anti-drug hysteria. Because when you think about it, accusing the Reagan administration of kowtowing to drug trafficking is like, people will say, well, what are you talking about? They were the most anti-drug administration in history. And if you look at all the propaganda they churned out, that certainly looks to be true. But the record is very clear that a lot of people in the Reagan administration knew that this was going on. As a matter of fact, one of the things that came out after my story came out was this thing called a Memorandum of Understanding that was signed between the Justice Department and the CIA in March of 1982. And this was just as the Contra program was getting started. This was just as the Afghan program was getting started. And what this Memorandum of Understanding did was relieve the CIA from having to report instances of narcotics trafficking or allegations of narcotics trafficking involving CIA agents. And they differentiated, they spelled it out. They said agents are this kind of people and they are not this kind of people, which effectively created a loophole for a lot of, drug traffickers to run cocaine and run other drugs with the CIA's knowledge, and yet the CIA did not have to tell the Justice Department about it. And that was the sum total of the change in this Memorandum of Understanding, which is very curious when you think about it. I mean, this bores a very specific loophole in the law just to exempt cocaine trafficking CIA agents from being reported. So I think that's pretty good evidence that, the Reagan administration knew this stuff was going on or strongly anticipated that it would, and that's why they carved this little loophole, which stayed in the law until like 1995, and then it was mysteriously taken out by the Clinton administration.
I think it's interesting, as you said about the Reagan administration, it's almost like it creates a plausible deniability to go after drug traffickers with such a vengeance and then turn around and secretly...
Well, sure it does, yeah, because they would be the least ones you suspect of winking at this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I imagine a lot of people would have just laughed at that it would have been preposterous to think that they would...
Well, a lot of this, when the stories first came out in the 1980s that these AP reporters were writing about, which was the Contras and drugs, people did laugh about it. That was the reaction. It was ridiculous. There was this big investigation done by the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee into the very issue of are the Contras dealing cocaine, the evidence came back, yes, they are. Here's documentation to prove it. Here's videotapes to prove it. And the press treated that like it was some, freak show. It was just a bunch of drug traffickers who can believe what they say. And they really ridiculed that report as well. And the reaction was the same after my story came out. It was just dismissed as some sort of ridiculous conspiracy theory. But after a while, I think people start to think, well, they can't all be ridiculous conspiracy theories. Then one of them's got to be right sometime.
Right, and in the case with your story, too, unlike your average newspaper clipping with so much actual factual evidence, this isn't just a book here. What we have is basically a documentation, a record of massive numbers of interviews, and, you didn't really speculate here.
You can't afford to when you've got an issue that's this sensitive. And the other thing is, there was so much out there you didn't need to speculate. You could just write down what people said and what they wrote and what they were arguing for and what they were doing. And that was the nice part about this story is I wasn't dealing with events that were going to change the next day. This was stuff that had happened. It was just a matter of assembling all the historical evidence to substantiate your argument. Like you said earlier, a lot of it was on the public record. A lot of it was in reporters' notebooks. A lot of it was in old newspapers' files. A lot of it was in old court records. But that's the nice thing about investigating the past. It doesn't disappear very easily. So we felt pretty confident, at least from the newspaper's point of view, that we could say this and we could back it up, or we wouldn't have put it in the paper in the first place.
Now, from the DEA or the Department of Justice, was there anyone who encouraged your effort?
Was there anyone who did what?
Well, would encourage this expose?
Oh, no, no. Sally Castillo certainly encouraged it because he was on that same case. But officially, no. The DEA was very adamant that. First they said, well, we can't write this story because it'll blow pending investigations. But they wouldn't tell me what pending investigations it would blow. And then they told us we couldn't write this story because it'll reveal confidential informants. And I said, well, the guy's not a confidential informant anymore because I know who he is. So, it's not confidential. And then they tried to say, okay, well, why don't you just leave this fellow out of the story and we'll set up an interview with this fellow. And that's when I started thinking, wait a minute, they're offering to set up an interview with an international drug trafficker. This is Norwin Meneses, who was in prison in Nicaragua at the time. And the DEA was telling me they could arrange an interview with him. Now, I don't know. I hadn't dealt with the DEA much before, but I didn't think arranging interviews with drug traffickers was part of their program. But in this case, it was, and the reason it was is because Meneses had been working for them, and they were pretty sure that they could get him to talk to me, which, inadvertently put a number of pieces together that I really didn't realize existed. And then when I went to interview them, they didn't want to talk about it. The DEA never responded to any of my Freedom of Information Act requests. None of the agents that were involved with Meneses wanted to be interviewed. So, no, they were not very cooperative at all. And neither was the CIA, and neither was the FBI.
A lot of people might have been discouraged by the suggestions from authorities to look the other way, etc. And I imagine probably there have been a few reporters in before you that have attempted to crack this to some degree and not been as successful. Did you ever feel that you were uncovering something bigger than you really had meant to, or that you maybe got in over your head?
Yes, to the first one. It was certainly something I had uncovered that I had never meant to. But did I think I got over my head? No. I had been an investigative reporter for, at that point, 17 years, and I had done a lot of very complicated stories. I had done a 17-part series on organized crime in the coal industry. I had done all sorts of stuff. So it was basically just another story to me. It was a more exciting story than a lot of the other ones I worked on, but the process of putting it together was identical. You just went out and found records and you found people to talk. And I thought, as far as safety goes, I wasn't really all that worried about it because most of this stuff had happened 10 or 12 years ago, and people had been either arrested for it or somehow punished for it or caught, and there wouldn't be any hesitancy about talking about it. And part of like Ricky Ross, that was certainly true. I mean, he and I talked for a long time. I went down and interviewed Meneses, and my partner and I interviewed him for a long time. So it was hard to get worried about it when people were fairly cooperative, except for the U.S. government.
That brings another question to mind. You just did seem to have a lot of cooperation from people who'd been involved in the trafficking. Did you ever get the sense that maybe some of those people rather enjoyed having this sort of thing come to surface, you know, how the CIA's been involved and stuff, maybe a little shock therapy for the general public?
I think Ricky Ross didn't mind that it came out because it told him, you know, basically that he'd been set up by his old buddies, which I don't think they really knew before that. And frankly, I think the story also showed that Ross had been largely entrapped by this drug operation that the DEA mounted against him. I think Meneses had another reason for wanting to talk. His reason was that he got abandoned by the CIA down in Nicaragua. You know, even after the Contra War, and I got into this towards the end of the book, he was working with the DEA on another covert operation down there to try to set up the Sandinista government on drug trafficking charges. He was playing this double agent for the DEA. And the Sandinistas found out about it and busted him with cocaine before he could like pull this stunt. And when Meneses wound up in jail, he wrote to the CIA at the U.S. Embassy and said, "Okay, guys, I'm in trouble. I need your help." And they said, "Sorry, buddy, you're just going to have to swing on this one." And he went to jail for 12 years. So I think he was a little annoyed because he had done a lot of work for the Contras and he had done a lot of work for the DEA, and they sort of cut him loose. So that was probably his motive for talking.
Yeah, and I guess we can sit back on this side of the fence and say, look, these are the laws. But, you know, I imagine when you're in that sort of position and you realize that reality speaking here, these activities are sanctioned, it's pretty hard for somebody in that position to justify himself going to jail when the people who supposedly made the laws said, oh, it's okay for you to break them.
There's a case pending out here now involving, amazingly the way history repeats itself, involving one of the traffickers that I wrote about. He worked for the San Francisco office of the Contras. He got arrested and convicted and was allowed to stay in this country until my stories came out. And then, as soon as the CIA and the Justice Department and everybody started contacting him for interviews, they began deportation proceedings against him. Fortunately, for the historical record, he was questioned and interviewed before they deported him, because basically what he said was a lot worse than even what I had written. He talked about direct CIA knowledge of the thing. He talked about how they were protected. He talked about a lot of stuff that I'm sure the CIA really didn't want to hear. But he's arguing against his deportation now on the grounds that when he was selling cocaine for the Contras, he was authorized to do this. He was working on an authorized covert operation. And I think there's enough evidence out there now to make it kind of an interesting case. I don't know where it'll go, but I mean this story just keeps going on and on and on.
Well, that is a pretty interesting angle to fight it from. But we're Canadian up here. I don't really know that much about where people can approach the law from your point of view, but just a sense of right and wrong here. One would think a person should be able to say, look, I was sanctioned by your government, et cetera, and not saying that should exonerate anybody, but personally I got to laugh inwardly if it helps keep this thing on the burner and, you know, resolves things somewhere down the road. Because things can't keep going on the way they are. This war is getting it's nuts. I don't know.
Well, yeah, and it has been nuts for a long time, and that's why I started writing about it back in the mid-'90s, because it was an enormous government program that we were spending billions and billions of dollars on, and all we were hearing about it was happy talk from the drug agencies that were, you know, profiting from this thing. So I started looking at it as covering it as sort of like a real war. You know, what is it doing to the people that it's hitting? And that's what led me to do these forfeiture stories, which were just...
Right, and that's a very important part of this, too, that we haven't really brushed on here, but forfeiture is a big motivational thing behind the police departments busting these types of things. They aren't even so concerned about arresting the criminals, are they, as much as confiscating their money and getting their percentage? That is scary.
That's what the series that I wrote said. There was case after case after case here in California of people being arrested, having property confiscated and not being charged, or having the charges dropped after they signed over the property. So it's a little hard to argue that there's no cause and effect when you see these kinds of results. And that series created another pretty big uproar because the program was up for legislative review, and after the series came out, the legislature canceled the program and rewrote the law. But that was a prime example of an idea that sounds great in principle. Go after the assets of drug traffickers. But when you actually looked at how the program was working, I mean, they were busting welfare mothers for having marijuana and taking their welfare checks away from them. They were taking kids' Nintendo games. They were taking snow tires. They were taking all sorts of stuff that didn't have anything to do with putting drug traffickers out of business.
And who's defining what an asset is? The part that really disturbs me is that somebody can work all their life.
It's anything you've acquired in the past 5 years.
Right, and I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a drug asset. If somebody gets caught with whatever they get caught, all of a sudden they're in jail and they can't defend themselves because everything's been taken away from them. They can't pay for a lawyer.
Yeah, see, the way it works is it's a civil proceeding, so you don't have any rights against self-incrimination. You have to basically, and you also have to basically prove yourself innocent. Rather than them proving you guilty, the presumption is that these are drug proceeds, and you have to show how they're not. Which, I don't know about you, but I could, if somebody came in and hauled away all my living room furniture, I couldn't produce receipts for it.
I must say, it's a really, really sad thing that this has come to pass, because, I mean, your nation has stood for freedom for so long, and that, this is eroded away at the foundation of liberty, somewhat like termites in a wood house. You just, how are you going to fix this? Do you see an end to this? Do you see anybody?
Yeah, I think, I'm one of these people that believe everything in history is cyclical. And the pendulum swings far the wrong way sometimes, and it'll swing back eventually. And I think we'll look back at this era like we look back at the McCarthy era from our vantage point and say, how did we ever let things get so screwed up? And I think things are changing, but the problem is there's been so much money invested in this and so many political careers invested in this drug war that nobody is going to say this thing is a flop, we're giving up today. They're going to just do it gradually over time and hope nobody notices that it's gone away. Because you can't admit a failure on a scale this colossal. Governments just don't do that.
If it's the DEA and Justice Department that are turning a blind eye and profiting over it, I don't really see it's likely that there is going to be a fix to this.
Well, I think one of the things that happened in this case was that they realized they could get caught at it. And whatever they want to say publicly, these agencies were in a panic over the story, especially the CIA. And, I'm not naive enough to believe that the CIA will not do this ever again. What I think it will do is think really long and hard about it and maybe not do it, or maybe decide it's not worth it. Whereas the last time they didn't even think about it, they just went ahead and did it. So, I mean, if that's progress, I suppose it's some.
Yeah. The other side of the coin, though, they could just figure out how to manage it better and have better public relations.
Well, you'll never be able to. That's the problem. I mean, you'll never be able to manage the CIA because of the national security laws in this country. Nobody can look at them except themselves. And you've got congressional committees that are supposed to investigate the CIA, and they're being run by former CIA agents, which is a fact. So you can't really expect Congress to do it. So, I mean, the only people left to do it is the press, and I think the lesson in my case, if there is one, is that you don't mess with the CIA and get away with it in this country.
Well, what you say about the national security laws, I think that is largely the crux of the matter. We've had the CIA has been basically indicated as being somewhat out of control for many years, and not necessarily just them. They often, I think, get blamed for decisions that get made in other places, be it the Pentagon, the Defense Intelligence, and whatever.
State Department.
Yeah, State Department. But there is still this business of the National Security Act and being able to hide any kind of crime behind the need for secrecy. And I would hope that this is that at some point there will be an evolutionary process here where this will just be discarded. I don't know how.
You made a very good point early on about they get blamed for a lot of things. It's important to note the CIA works for the president, and they're as much bureaucratic as anybody, any government agency. So when they get told to do something, and Claire George, who was one of the CIA officials who was implicated in Iran-Contra and later convicted, said as much in court. I mean, he said, when somebody from the White House calls and tells me to jump, I say, how high? He said, that's the bureaucrat in me. So the CIA is not this rogue agency out there running around on its own. It's an arm of the presidency. So the question becomes, what kind of powers do we give the CIA to be able to do? I mean, if we get some crazy man in the White House or some, guy like Ronald Reagan who was half asleep half the time, they can do pretty much anything. So I think the only thing you're going to be able to do is say, no, you can't overthrow foreign governments. No, you can't do this kind of stuff. No, you can't do drug trafficking, which they do have on the books now. Surprisingly, they didn't have such a law on the books before my series came out. But now there's a law that says you can't traffic in drugs. So things change, but not until there are basic fundamental changes in the way that agency works.
Right, and a lot of these things come to bear by public pressure, and let's face it, people want to be reelected, aside from the suspicious, perhaps occasional bit of vote tampering. There still is the need to curry public favor, and as people become more aware of these issues, it's going to be a lot more dangerous to get caught doing that sort of thing.
Well, that presumes that people are going to get elected and care about it, and the last two congressmen who took on the CIA was Frank Church, and there was a New York congressman who did the investigations in the 70s, Otis Pike. They were both run out of office, and they said later that they attributed their defeats to their investigation of the CIA. That's the one thing. I mean, CIA is a very powerful organization. It's got a lot of friends in a lot of places, and it's very hard to change from outside of it. It's very hard to change from outside. And I don't think there's a politician in America who will run on a, let's clean up the CIA platform, because that's just not cool.
But on the other hand, if via other avenues drug laws are loosened, and heaven forbid should there be such a thing as dropping the prohibition, all of a sudden a lot of the secret funding channels and whatnot, those will be shut down. I think it's been long established that a lot of the CIA, with cover companies and stuff, there's money flowing all over the place that hasn't been able to keep track of. And if those things go to fund wars, that's something that's beyond the ability of Congress to really keep a handle on. Whereas with the advent of technology, be it money laundering software, to keep track of these things, or whatever it takes, at some point the evolution of change just might curtail some of this. And, then there are things that happen in other places of the world which sort of are going to undoubtedly have some effects on U.S. foreign policy. I mean, just looking at the attitudes here in Canada, all of a sudden in the last federal election we had a federal marijuana party, and in our province here you had a provincial one. And I think they were pouffawed at first, but they got enough votes that people in political positions sort of sat back. They're taking notice, and maybe they're going to start dealing with some of these issues, realizing that these are important to people.
Well, I agree with you, and you can look at what's happening in California with the various ballot propositions we've had here, for medical marijuana.
Right.
Now they had the one for decriminalizing basically, non-violent drug offenses, putting them in treatment instead of in jail. So the irony is that this stuff didn't come from the government; it came from the people. These were popular referendums, and so you're right. I mean, it has to come from the bottom up, and I think what you're seeing now is what I was talking about earlier, is a gradual swinging back of the pendulum, where people are going to say, look, we've given away our freedoms and our liberties for too long for this drug war. It's time to surrender. Let's figure out something else to do. But that's what but the government is never going to come out and say, oh yeah, this thing's a mess, we're giving up. They're just going to keep pretending they're doing it, only do something else.
Right. Well, personally, while I'd love to see a whole bunch of bashful, red-faced apologies, I think I'd be really happy just to concede a little bit of gradual evolutionary change and take that instead. I don't need to see everybody in jail who is guilty, but I would like to.
And you never will. So.
No, so why even bother wasting my energy, right? But on the other hand, we do have to believe that wonderful efforts like yours are actually going to pay off, and are paying off even as we speak.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you wouldn't do it if you thought it was pointless, and frankly, it wasn't pointless. I mean, things were laid out for historians and for future generations to see that never would have been seen. So, that's really the only way you can progress is to learn from the past, and we got the story out.
Yeah, and a wonderful job of that. Are you working on that sort of thing at all? What are you doing these days?
What I'm doing these days, I'm writing for a couple of magazines, and I'm working as a consultant to the California Legislature on government oversight issues. I do, put together oversight hearings, and we've been doing some work on the energy crisis out here, and that's what we're still working on, investigating power companies.
Okay, so you're
I'm still doing pretty much the same thing I was doing before, only now I'm doing it for the California Legislature, which actually has the power to do things, to change things.
right. Well, I'm sure that your investigative energies will be put to some good use there, because I mean this is an amazing. Well, I won't say bit. I will say a lot of research that you did, and I think that future historians are going to continue to owe you a debt of gratitude for putting so much energy into something that a lot of people might have given up on.
Well, yeah. Well, thanks.
Well, actually, that's not a frivolous compliment. So, as much as you're welcome, I really do mean it, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who would say so.
Well, I appreciate that.
Okay, well, is there anything that we haven't brought up that you'd like to bring up before we wind up the show?
No, I think you folks did a marvelous job of hitting everything. It's, I can tell you read the book.
Yeah, well, like I said, fascinating, really, really excellent work, and this book came highly recommended right from day one. So, you're making some great waves out there. We would like to really encourage you if you get on any more of these roles, or you want to blow the lid on anything, you just let us know. We'll be happy to have you back here.
Actually,
all right. Well, thanks.
Yeah, in the front cover, one of the things that really grabbed me right away was there was a whole list of compliments from other people who had read the book. It's a great job. And then there was the one there from Oliver North, absolute garbage, I believe.
Right. That was my favorite one.
Yeah, I went, okay, I got to read this now.
That was my favorite one. My publishers didn't want to put that on there. I actually had two. I had one from Oliver North and another one from, I think, Dewey Claridge, who was another CIA guy complaining about me. But they thought Oliver North was better, so. Yeah.
Good
and I did too.
Okay, well, once again, we'd like to thank you for sharing your time with us.
Well, I appreciate it. All right, well, thanks.
Yeah, great having you here.
Okay. Good night then.